Hey everybody, welcome to a discussion that we are prayerfully and also just been looking forward to doing. And I'm glad that you decided to join us with our family discussion. Really, that's what this is. And the reason I say that is because everybody here in this group is a part of the same church here at In Focus. And many of them have been a part of this body for a long time. But also, outside of myself and Kēvin and Caleb, which some of you may know, these other three men are involved in law enforcement here in our area. And so I'm going to have them introduce themselves, or I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves so you know who they are and what they do. And then our goal really is just to talk freely and honestly and openly with one another. And as brothers in Christ, as a family of God, and ask God to use that to help us as we move forward in being who God's called us to be as the church in the earth today, because we desperately need that light. So I'll start right here to my right, and give us your name and any other details about what you have been doing.
So my name is Jim March. Been in law enforcement for over 20 years. Started off in military police in the Air Force. Spent some time working at the Columbia County Sheriff's Office, Richmond County Sheriff's Office, and now I'm a patrol commander at the Harlan Police Department.
Okay. Well, you've covered all the counties, all the areas, all right? And, okay, here to my far right, another Officer Jim.
I'm Jim DiRenzo, and they do call me Officer Jim. I'm with the kids on Wednesday. I normally direct the traffic on Sundays, on the days I'm off. I've been in law enforcement approximately 24 years. I was 10 years with Richmond County and about 14 with Columbia County. I was on motorcycle patrol for about 6 years, which I kind of enjoyed. They actually paid me to ride a motorcycle.
Yeah, I was like, that I would dig more than the bike. Like the bicycle thing, I'm not down with that. Especially out here when it's 95 degrees. I'm like, who gets bike patrol, like pedal bike patrol? So motorcycle sounds actually a little more fun.
Yeah, it was fun.
All right.
So my name is Tom Digsby. I've been in law enforcement for 20 years. I decided I wanted to go into law enforcement while I was a student at Georgia. And I started my career with the Georgetown County Sheriff's Office out in South Carolina, and worked narcotics there, investigations, uniform patrol, and then back in 2006 moved back here, which is home for Sohaila and I, my wife, and got a job with the Columbia County Sheriff's Office. I've been there since 2006. I was on road patrol for a little while before I went to investigations, and I'm currently the staff sergeant in charge of the Crimes Against Persons Division with the Sheriff's Office.
Yeah, and that is serious stuff that I know Tom deals with too, and all of you guys, I appreciate. We got now 60 plus years, it sounds like, of experience and working in law enforcement. And so the reason, like I said earlier, we wanted to have you all is because as we are in this, culture, and you guys are in it even more so, of dealing with the issue of racism, or dealing with the issue of systems that people feel like need reform, or whatever the case may be. And of course, I say this up front, outside of the church, outside of the gospel, outside of Jesus, anything that's not under his rulership is ultimately going to need some work and some transforming and some reforming and all of that. So that's not a negative thing. Neither is it a bad thing. It actually is a good thing. But I believe as a church, we kind of have to lead out in that and help. So part of that is let's sit down with some of our officers that are our brothers in Christ here, and let's just talk about some things that maybe you guys have seen, but then also your perspective, because it's a different perspective. Being in law enforcement for 20 plus years, as almost all of you have been, you've seen a lot of things. So let me preface it with this as well, and then I'll ask you guys a question. We have to understand that first and foremost, the gospel is the answer, period, as I was just saying. However, the gospel calls us to action, And so there are things that we have to do to, as Micah 6:8 says, do justly and love mercy. And I'm sure you all have in your swearing into office, or however y'all might do that, but y'all have to swear to do things as far as protecting, and you guys probably know it. I don't want to put you on the spot if it's been a long time and you've forgotten, but justice, standing up for justice, and then protecting those who can't protect themselves. Then as Christians, it's doing so mercifully, and that is with love. So I guess my first question, and anybody can go first, it doesn't matter, and there's no particular order. What are some things that you all are seeing in this current climate, maybe that concern you, or some things maybe that concern you, and what's going on around us, or and that may even move into things that you have seen in your years in law enforcement that you feel like, either have contributed to where we are, or maybe you don't. I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, but what are some things, whenever like the light turns on, it's like, oh, there's stuff in this room. And that's what I feel like. There's just, man, and that doesn't mean everything that we're seeing is true or right or good. It just means it seems like there's light or videos or something all the time right now. So are there things that you're seeing on the law enforcement side that you feel like, man, these are some things that might need to change, or we could do better?
So I'd start off and just say my experience here in Columbia County has been positive. I think the citizens do support law enforcement, and in this time have been very supportive from my experience. So I do appreciate that. I think any time that you see something that happened to like Mr. Floyd, and it shows a bad light on the whole profession. And so that is what's a challenge for me, is that because of an incident that happened, in Minnesota, it reflects on, how people look at me and my agency. So that's been a challenge. And just there's a perception that all officers, or many officers, are out here being skewed, and there's thousands of contacts each day, and those are positive experiences, and we only see the fraction of the small infractions that go wrong, and then that reflects poorly on our profession.
That's great.
What happened with Mr. Floyd is so immediately and obviously unacceptable and wrong that it's one of those things, statement you hear sometimes is it shocks the conscience. You see that, and as a police officer, the first time I saw it, I was just in disbelief at what I was seeing, because I could see there was another officer there. It wasn't until like the second or third time I saw more and learned more about it that I realized there were like 8 officers there. And holding someone down after they're secured in handcuffs it's very rare that you would need to do that. There is sometimes a need for it, especially if you're by yourself and you're exhausted because you were just fighting the suspect. You're waiting for someone else to come. There are situations where you would need to hold someone down. Putting your knee in the back of their neck, I would never imagine a reason to do that. You don't need to do that to hold someone on the ground when they're handcuffed behind their back. But the fact that there were other officers standing around, and there is no threat. When a man is handcuffed behind his back and there's 8 officers standing around, I can't imagine how you could articulate that there was any kind of danger or threat that needed to keep that man on the ground. Even without a knee in his back, just laying on the ground with your hands cuffed behind your back, it's hard to breathe. Every officer is trained that. Every officer knows that. So, once we arrest somebody, we all know, and we're all trained, once we arrest somebody, I am responsible for his safety and well-being now. And we use the phrase, you own the situation and you own whatever happens. And you've got to own that as an individual. So, if I've handcuffed somebody and I've, back when I was working narcotics especially, there have been a number of times when I've had to fight somebody and then get them in handcuffs. And then I immediately start tending to them. I sit them up so they can breathe. I've had to lean someone against a tree for a while or something like that while we're both catching our breath in the woods. And then we walk out, and in my mind, it's always been no hard feelings kind of thing because, it's what I do. It's what I've chosen to do. They've chosen to break the law. I've chosen to enforce the law. And once they're in custody, it's over. It's done. So, and I think that's a problem that the public obviously sees. I feel like I'm going on way too long, so y'all feel free to jump in.
My question on the back of that is do you guys see a problem when things like this happen and the people always want to give the benefit of the doubt to the law enforcement officer, even when we see the benefit of the doubt goes far beyond it would for someone who wasn't in uniform?
Right. And so the question becomes, well, this one was caught on video. How many times is it not caught on video? And what kind of a culture allows something like that to happen? And that's in my opinion, which I'll really start talking a lot when we get into this. In my opinion, it's the culture that allows that, and that's a culture that you cannot get rid of until police unions are eradicated. Police unions cannot exist. They do nothing but protect bad cops. States like Georgia and South Carolina don't have police unions. It's against the law, and there's no need for them. We don't have any problem staffing police departments and getting things done. And it's just a culture and a leadership that goes up in the unions. And I know union cops, and there's lots of good union cops who will completely disagree with me because all they've ever known is the union. But having never been a part of a union in 20 years of law enforcement, and none of us have, we've all been police officers here in the South, there's no need for it. There's just no need for it. All it does is sure, it negotiates contracts and all that stuff. That's usually to the detriment of the citizens and the taxpayers and their budget. It creates bad pension funds, and it's just not good on so many levels. But the most important level is that it protects bad apples. It protects people like that officer who killed Mr. Floyd. If it weren't for a union, he probably would have lost his job 15 years earlier. It's not hard to identify a bad cop, an aggressive cop, a cop who, because we all know, we work with people, and it doesn't take long to realize this guy's not going to last. He's not going to make it. And we know he's not going to make it because we know he's going to get fired. He's going to get run out of here. There's no union here to protect a bad cop. And, and there's no stigma about cops. There's no big blue wall or anything like that in agencies around here. I've been to classes with northern cops or cops from big cities, and they've often tried to, pick on or whatever cops in southern areas like Georgia and stuff, that we don't stick together, that we'll write another cop a ticket, or that we'll, we don't have this I'm on the job, we all look out for each other mentality. I think that's a good thing. There's no reason for that. I'm on the job, and I love this job, and I've dedicated my life to it, and I think it's a profession. And if you don't feel the same way and you're on the job, I want you gone.
Right.
And
so, let me ask that question
about that,
because I think that dives into what we would call like a systemic type thing. That would dive into a system that needs to be fixed.
Right.
So, how do we address that? Like, here's the thing that I was trying to say earlier. I don't know if I said it well, but how do we address a system that needs some fixing, reform, or could actually, in your opinion, a union be broken without demonizing the individuals that are within the system, like you all and others, who are also made in the image of God? So, like, we've got a black man who is wrongfully killed because a system in the area that he is broken. And so it doesn't mean that every individual in that system is bad or wrong, but it does mean that there's something in the system that they're working within that's not helpful. Right. So how do we reform that without it being about, well, I'm an officer and we've got to, like you're saying, I got to stand up for like I saw one thing talk about integrity, that an officer, one of the 4 things that an officer needs to have, one of them being integrity. Okay, well, outside of the gospel, integrity is not just something you normally have, especially if you're given power. But then the idea was this was just a suggestion. I'm like, well, is that really going to help? Like rotating their partner so that there's not such a bond in between that, like, the guy covers for his other guy. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Right.
He does something he knows he shouldn't have done. He's like, hey, I'm gonna need you to cover for me, and they do. So is that TV? Is that like a detective show that I've watched too much of? You know, like,
I
or does
think
that
the
happen?
fact that there were 8 other police officers, is that number right? 8, I think it was. 8 other police officers standing around watching, to me, says that won't work, because there's a culture of keeping your mouth shut. There's a culture of protect each other at all cost. And administration, who has to answer to the politicians, they want to do away with that culture, I'm sure, because it's in their best interest to do away with that culture, and it's the right thing to do. But they have no ability to, because they can fire, and often they do. And if you do some research on this, if individuals would do some research on this, which I just wish people would do, you'd see there is time and time again where an officer does a terrible thing, usually caught on video, and they're fired. And then 3 months later, they're reinstated because the union got them reinstated during the appeals process. And they get their back pay and everything else, and they know that. Officers who are brutalizing people, who are not caring about their action, who are mistreating the citizens they're supposed to protect, they know they're protected by the union. They know nothing's going to happen to them. They know I might get fired, but then that just means 3 months off, and when I get reinstated, I get my back pay. So my thought is, really, and the local governments will have no ability to get rid of unions because they're way too powerful politically. It has to be a federal law. The federal government has to outlaw unions in every law enforcement, federal law enforcement, state, local. Unions and law enforcement should be federally banned.
I think we can all sit here together, law enforcement and general common citizens, and say that in a country with our history of oppression of a people, there's no way we can expect a system at this point to be perfectly sound or to be equal and impartial to all people. Because in the nature of the history of the world and the history of countries and governments, the United States is relatively young. That's the thing about it, and especially compared to how long we've been removed from slavery and how long we've been removed from Jim Crow, it's not much time for us to just say the system is good. So we can all sit here and say at some level that our system is broken, and we can see a video and say that our system is broken, and it could have, if not, it definitely contributed to that. So with you pointing out unions being a contributor to that broken system, is there anything else that maybe you would say, or Mr. Jim, you would say, or Mr. Tom, if you have something else, another aspect of our system that is broken outside of just people's hearts? Because obviously hearts are broken, but there are things we can put in place in a system that checks people's hearts. So what are some other, I guess, practical steps on that, on top of unions, that need change, reform?
Well, I think just in unison with that, I think the justice system itself has some systemic problems. Again, if you're a minority, you may have less opportunity for an alternative, and you may be incarcerated or receive a bigger penalty than a Caucasian offender. So that's kind of hand in hand how it goes. What I would say this, and I agree with everything Tom says, what I would say, though, is that the people need to understand not every use of force by an officer is inappropriate. So what happens, though, is you have an incident where Mr. Floyd's situation was egregious, but then you have good officers who have to exercise use of force, and that's scrutinized, and then they're just, what if it's a Caucasian person or officer dealing with a minority, and they're automatically assumed to be a racist. So I don't really want us to believe that, because I would say the majority of officers are not like that. I agree with everything Tom said. It's a culture within your department. Sometimes it's just whatever your community accepts, right? So let's say that how do these departments last? Well, one of the reasons is that the people who aren't subjected to that brutality, they just turn a blind eye, and they don't challenge these organizations, because really, if you think about it, law enforcement is supposed to be augment the citizenry. And so those citizens are going to have to stand up and basically say, that's not acceptable in our jurisdiction, and they can force a change. Now, I agree, places where there's unions, it's going to be harder. But I think there's tools. I think it's a good thing when cities are standing up and saying, hey, this is not working. We need to defund this department, and maybe we need to start from scratch. But that's because you've kind of allowed it to kind of get in its worst state. But citizens have to get involved. There have to be citizen review boards or interactions and just constant touch points, and companies that have a louder voice need to make sure that they speak up and just hold law enforcement agencies accountable.
Is it something, I'm just asking as a citizen of this county, but is it something that, again, the backdrop here is we all understand that the only way to transform a society is to have a lot of people with transformed hearts within that society doing that. So I do want to ask that question because I think it relates to each of you, but is it something as easy as, well, you got to vote? I'm like, well, what are we voting for, and who are we voting for? Is it activism? Is it community development, which I think that is part of it, that I know for us as a church we want to get more and more involved in, is community development, because, as you're right, there is a skewedness to incarceration, and even because of the communities and how they're developed, which has come out of things like Jim Crow or redlining and stuff like that has in some ways basically set up certain police departments for failure. It's like it's a losing situation. Mm-hmm. And it's not your fault per se. It's not. But it is the system's fault, and it's the system beyond the law enforcement. It's the government. It's how we have set up things to where someone has an advantage that someone else doesn't. So, I guess if I'm watching, I'm like, okay, well, and I just read a book, because this is where, as a white person, the question is, well, what do we do? And it's like, that's what we jump to first. We want to fix it without the lament, mm-hmm. Without the listening, without slowing down. There may not be anything to do right this second other than build relationships. But there are things eventually to do. I'm just saying, what is that?
Well, building relationships, what you just said, is the big thing. I think that it's why Columbia County and Sheriff's Office and its citizens, and even the Grovetown or Harlan Police Department and its citizens, have such a good working relationship with one another. It's because we, as an agency that comes from top down, and every officer and every deputy knows it, place a high value on relationships and good relationships and respecting the community we police. And that's what I think other agencies, from the outside as a police officer, but looking at agencies that, you talk about red line areas and stuff like that where they're set up for failure. You have to, as an individual officer, take ownership if you work in that area and say, I can make a change. I can do something different.
So speaking of building relationships and trust, what would you gentlemen say to our black brothers and sisters who feel fearful whenever they are interacting with police? They feel like there's some type of looming, like, I don't know if I should trust this officer based on what I've seen or what I've experienced in the past or what I've heard. And what would you say to those black brothers and sisters who feel that way?
It looks really bad. It looks like if you're a black person, based on what you see on society and TV and YouTubes and the movement of, that's going on right now, it makes you think, well, you're not safe as a young black man. The police officers are racist and they want to hurt me. That's what you would think, and I can understand why they would think that. But the truth is that we have to find a way for these people who are stirring up all this hatred and trying to make this divide. We have to find a way to get around that and get through that and actually communicate like this, and actually sit down and have people say, hey man, I'm scared every time I interact with a police officer. Here's why. And me say, I get that. Here's why I think you might be misinformed, and deal with it that way. Now, as far as police go, we were talking a little bit earlier, and I don't remember if it was on camera or off camera, about, racial issues in society and systemic racism and stuff like that. And a minute ago you gave an example of a young black man that we all know who was a very good human being in every respect, and the police called on him because he was wearing a hood. Well, that was the fault of the people at that institution that called the police. And that's the kind of stuff that society needs to work to fix and repair. I think in law enforcement, those kind of officers just need to be gone. We can fix and repair hatred and racism and stuff in other places, but not in law enforcement. In law enforcement, if you're identified as being hateful or racist or dishonest or something, there's no class for that. There's just leave. You can't carry a gun and badge and police people if that's the kind of character you have. So racism is speaking specifically about racism, and there are other issues, but it's something in law enforcement that people say we need to deal with this. No, just identify it and eliminate it. Society has been working, I think, over time, and unfortunately it's taken a long time to head in the right direction to overcome racism and make it truly a thing of history. But law enforcement ought to be freed up to make it a thing of history within their ranks much, much quicker than society at large, because it's just too dangerous and it's wrong for those of us who do build relationships with the community. We hate it just as much to see something like that and know that all the trust and all the hard work that maybe some good officers in Minneapolis had been doing in their small area that they patrol. There probably were officers who've been trying real hard to do the right thing, and that vanished. Could have been doing it for years, and that vanished the moment Mr. Floyd was murdered. And so, I mean, it's just as harmful to police officers, but I don't want to minimize it and say it's what I was going to say a minute ago is that it's not just because it doesn't happen a lot doesn't mean it's okay that it happens a little. Yeah. And it kind of goes back to, I think, an example you gave once about a perfectly clean bottle of water. How much raw sewage can I put in that and it be okay? It's still 99.99% clean water, but it's just tiniest fraction of raw sewage. Is that okay? No, we got to get that out of there. We got to identify it and get it out of there. And that's what the within the ranks of law enforcement, that's our responsibility, is to clean up the ranks. And that's why we'll get on such a soapbox about unions, because unions make it impossible to clean up the ranks. But it's also on the other side of the conversation, leaders in the black community need to step up and speak out against people who are just trying to stir up hate because it serves their purpose, even though they're saying, oh no, this is all about, pointing out. No, it's not, because if a mob is not about any kind of reason or solving anything, conversations, being honest and being truth and being real is how that happens. So particularly, I think church leaders in the black community need to step up and say, these police officers are literally putting their lives on the line in our community for us. And we need to talk with them, and we need to work better with them, and we need to figure this out through conversations, not endless memes and Facebook ranting and certainly not through rioting and that side of thing. It needs to be a conversation both ways.
Yeah, I think that's part of why, even with this, and I'll say what I heard a pastor friend of mine say. He's from Seattle, and having a conversation like this, because there are a lot of conversations right now, and I know, that's the reality is, just like the conversation that we had last week, some people like it, some people didn't. Just like this conversation, when we put this out, some people will like it, some people won't. Okay, well, first of all, that's the nature of just humans. But then secondly, if we're not willing, and this is what he said, it's like we have to be willing to have hard conversations where, particularly maybe even this point, a white person sticks their foot in their mouth. Like we're all trying to make sure I'm thinking what I'm saying. I don't want to say anything that would be, incendiary, but it's like if we talk long enough, we'll find things that I don't know if I agree completely, but if I can't be honest about what I'm feeling or thinking and somebody go, that's probably not right or that's not good, then it'll never change. So if I can't say, well, up until last week, I didn't know what Juneteenth was. Or up until a couple of years ago, I never heard of the Great Migration. And that goes back to kind of the system, if you will, of white privilege, or where I look at everything through a filter of a white man. Like I tell Pastor Adrian, Pastor Sterling, and others. I'm like, I can't do anything but that. So the idea of having a talk, and I was going to ask you, Jim, was that a talk that your dad had with you? Because I believe I've met your father before. He's a big man and gregarious, but did he have a talk with you? Is that, you have a son, is that a talk that you've thought about? Is that something that, being in this county, being in our context, maybe, like I said, different than others, but still a black man in the South, a black man in law enforcement in the South, is there anything in that we're talking about with Kēvin, we're pulling over, or what do I think? I keep my hands here, I don't move. I mean, there's certain things I just do just because it's an officer and I don't want him to think I'm doing anything stupid. But does it go any further with that, or did you have that kind of discussion?
So I think, for me, it's a different perspective. So I'll give you an example. So I grew up on a military base until my father retired here. When we moved into a predominantly white neighborhood. So growing up, walking down the street, there were times that I was called as a suspicious person. Walking up the road, Columbia Road, before it was populated the way it is, I got yelled at, different names. So I would be deceitful to say that there are some communities, if I'm driving or traveling in a rural community, that I'm not extra sensitive as being an African American male being pulled over because some rural towns, depending on those officers, they could, because there's discretion in how officers, whether they give you a ticket or things like that. So so do I give the talk to my son or my nephews? Yes, I do. And I think that it's a complicated issue. So as a leader in a law enforcement agency, you talk about accountability. I think it goes both ways. So in the example we talked about, where someone called in a person suspicious and the police show up, we get called to somebody's house. So, oftentimes people are like, hey, you're harassing me. And what I really tell them is, I was just riding in my car. They called me over here, so I wasn't harassing you. But there's two things. So I think a lot of it has to do with, I believe that the police department, since regardless of whether it's right or wrong, we need to continually reassess, to rebrand ourselves, to make sure that we are engaging the community. But a lot of it, I think, has to do with culture as well. And so I give people an example. Even if I was coming to church here versus maybe going to a Baptist church that I grew up in, when you're worshiping, it's pretty subtle. There's not a lot of jumping up and down. People aren't passing out. I think if that happened, people would be uncomfortable, right? So the same thing when I talk about the African American community, when I policed in there. So if I grew up in Columbia County, Prairie Rural, I'm a Caucasian person. It's always been subtle. But African Americans express themselves more. They're going to be louder. They're going to be moving around. They're going to take a young Caucasian officer, introducing them into that environment where they go and somebody's hooping and hollering. That's going to put them at a stage of discomfort, right? And so they need to understand. So if I was going to be deployed somewhere to another country, I need to learn that culture. Well, so we have a different culture. So we have to work on that, in our policing. But the flip side of that is, if you're an African American, you've had a bad experience with a police officer, what have you done with that? Have you just kind of kept that in? Did you report that? Or did you just kind of tell your other people that you're, friends with or things like that? Voice that complaint. Law enforcement agencies are getting cameras. That's, pretty much standard. They can go back and look at that video to see if there was an issue, and then they can talk with you. Well, hey, either you say, well, this is the reason why we did that, or we did wrong and we need to do better. So we've definitely have to do that. But just because you don't trust the police or you've had a bad experience does not give an African American license to escalate the situation. So when somebody comes come and engage you as an officer and you just are automatically hostile, well, you're gonna meet that sometimes with that. So, but ultimately, we have to recognize as police officers, even though most encounters are positive, we have to continue to work on that. But I would say, as African Americans, we need to get more involved because the police force is here to serve, and we can't have this perception as just them against us, or we won't make a lot of progress.
We have to be free on both sides to have an open conversation without immediately jumping on one another, and we have to recognize that there's reasons for that. We had a call in Columbia County earlier this week where a lady called, well, several people called because they thought that there was a Klan rally at the Food Line. Are y'all familiar with this? In Grovetown over the weekend. It was just some people with some jacked up pickup trucks who regularly meet there and just look at their trucks. And some deputies, I don't know if it was deputies or officers, were also there. I don't know if they were hired for security or just stopping by. But a lady called. I was talking to one of the road patrol sergeants about this, and he took the call. And a black lady called and said that there are some deputies in her neighborhood, and she was calm and she was respectful, and she wanted to know if we could tell her which of our deputies were members of the Ku Klux Klan, so she knew if it was any of the ones in the neighborhood. And to me, I'm like, what? She wanted what? It just seems so crazy. But at the same time, you have to recognize that she actually thinks this. She believes this, and that's a problem. That we both have to figure out. That as a police agency, we have to figure out, why does this educated middle-class woman think this? And we have to be free to talk to her and say, this stuff where you're getting your information, it's lies. It's not true. Talk to me. I'll talk to you. We'll figure out what the truth is and what we really need to do to go forward.
Yeah, I think when I was reading this recently, as soon as you get to name calling, good, bad, whenever, that's the problem. Whenever something's, and then you take now you start to escalate and go to other things like, well, you're a part of this and you're this matters. When you get into the name calling and putting everybody into categories, you've lost the ability to have a civil discourse, a dialogue to where you could learn something. For example, like when Jim's talking about, how he grew up in this area and some of the things that, he's already been through or went through as a kid, being a predominantly white neighborhood, and the names that he may have been called. That's the stuff you have to hear as a white person to go, it's different. It's been different. That's the privilege that we were talking about before. It's like, I didn't get called those names. I didn't think twice about doing certain things that Jim probably thought about twice doing. So there is, if you want to call it like Caleb was saying earlier, the years of stuff that you don't just stop. And that's where, as us, we have to dig into the pain a little bit of going, okay, I can't just go, well, that was then. Okay, it was, but it wasn't that far ago. And my friend here, who's a fellow officer, has been treated ways I wouldn't want him treated. He's, same way my friends or my son, my kids, whatever. So we got to talk about this. We have to have a civil conversation. We know from our context that it's Jesus, but then where do we take Jesus into our area? So here's a question I think I could pose to all of you all that I think is important. How have you, as a believer, seen, and I've heard it some and just how you've talked about the way you handle yourself, but how have you seen your faith help you in doing what you do to make the connections that we're talking about, or to de-escalate things, or to be able to get beyond something? How's your faith helped you be the law enforcement officer that you are?
I had an experience in Richmond County that when I was in Richmond County, on my uniform, I would wear Warrior for Christ. And I went to a call, and it was an older black gentleman. And when I walked up, I asked him what was going on, and he explained to me. And before I went in, he said, I see your pen. He said, now I know I'll be treated fairly. And I talked to the person inside, and I talked to him. And just wearing the Warrior for Christ pen showed him that I wouldn't be biased. I wouldn't be, it wouldn't be a racist thing. That, I never exhibited that. But when just wearing the pen, he saw that he was going to be treated fairly. And I think if officers were more into their churches and their attitudes were a little bit different, it would exhibit to the people that they talk to.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, for me, it's about how you approach things. It's about service. You know, being because you have to have a reputation. So you're not in uniform 24 hours a day. So when you interact with people, whether it's that individual, that family, you're making a reputation for yourself. And if you profess to be a Christ follower, your actions need to show that. Because, hey, what if somebody I interacted with this week, they're in our church, they come to a church service, and have I represented myself that appropriately? Right. But, it's like, was this person respectful and kind and, willing to listen and not just try to overpower them? And so that's the way I approach it, because, again, you are a citizen in the community, and so you do that as a profession, but you want to hold yourself accountable. You have to answer for that behavior in the long run. And so I believe, whatever you do in the, those dark moments will come to light. And so if you don't, use your profession or act in that profession, it's going to come out somehow or another.
That's great.
I wonder.
Yeah, that's great.
So,
And I think what all you guys are saying, the reality is Christ followers and believers in whatever we do, and for you guys as police officers, is it should mark us with our actions and our behavior as visibly as it does with a pin on our shirt or on our uniform. And I think, sadly, we have all met people in churches or in the community who say one thing, wear one thing, and live another way. So I think that is the sad part of it, is just like a man can see you with a pin on and say, this is a believer, he's going to treat me in an unbiased way. That should be the truth. But then there's times when it's not. There's times when throughout history we've seen that the church hasn't cared, and that there's been Christians who have actually advocated for just the opposite of justice. So I guess, like, as believers, it's on us to take responsibility for ourselves, kind of like you talked about in communities and police districts, whatever, you taking responsibility for your ability to make change in that area. The same thing as Christ followers. It is our duty, and you guys as law enforcement officers that are Christians and believers, it's your duty to represent Christ in law enforcement, both to your coworkers, your officers that you work with, and to the community around you. And so I appreciate you guys addressing that and saying that. I think the important thing that we've all kind of mentioned with something like this is the ability to have conversation in a way that isn't just immediately hostile.
Mm-hmm.
Because the reality is like, there's been things said by others here right now that it's like, man, I wish I could have put those words to that feeling that I've had. And then there's been other things that it's like, I don't know if I agree with that, or I don't know if I feel the same way about that specific topic or event or what happened. But if we can't come to a place where we have conversations about things where we might come to a different conclusion that isn't intrinsic to our gospel, if we can't have conversations that aren't core gospel issues and come to different conclusions without hating one another and without publicly disrespecting one another, then we're not yielding the fruit of the Spirit that we've so professed to be growing in. So, like we're saying, there will be people that listen to this and maybe don't agree with something Mr. Jim said, or Tom said, or I said, or Kēvin, whatever.
Whoa. You better agree with whatever I said. That happens
Well, I
all
would
the
say,
time.
you know,
Everybody
I would-
always agrees with everything that I say here.
That's what we want you to think. But my answer to that would be, and a statement that I would want to say to anybody watching this, particularly anyone that knows us. Well, I guess only anyone that knows us. I guess you could send me an email otherwise. But if I've said something that you don't quite agree with, or you think I was wrong or something like that, then follow up with me. because I want you to know what it is I think and feel, and I could be wrong. I might not have enough information. I might have said something tonight that I don't have a particular piece of information that if I did have, if I was better educated, I would have a different opinion. And, maybe you can offer that to me by reaching out to me, and instead of just saying, well, Digsby, he's not the guy I thought he was. He said this and this. Well, why do you disagree with that? Maybe I am wrong, or maybe I didn't come across clearly or something, but just not talking about it's not going to fix it.
That's good. Can't completely suppress everything.
Well, I just want to say, thank you for being a part of the discussion and just talking. And again, we don't want it to be just talking. We want it to be an at least a good example of the fact that we can dialogue, that we can cause you to think. That's the thing. If anything else, I would say is like, look, you don't know everything. Nobody knows everything. And in all of that's going on right now, if we can't learn something, then we're not trying. Like, I can't tell you how many books I've read in the last 2 months. Just things. I'm just trying to, I want to understand. I want to understand where people are coming from. I want to, obviously I'm reading, there's the Bible right there in the middle of us, but understand everything through the lens of the gospel, but also be a positive influence for the gospel in our community, for all people. And one of the things we say here all the time, everybody comes to the ground of the cross and it's level. And where it's not in our society, then it needs to be fixed. And where it's not level in how we handle things, it needs to be fixed. And, listen, if anybody watching from other places, like, man, if I had people like those guys on our force, then we'd have less trouble. And that's true, because a transformed heart is the only thing that can transform society. So, and then the other thing I would say in closing is power can easily be abused by human beings. History proves that. That's why Jesus came as the most powerful and served instead of lording over. Interestingly enough, protect and serve is a part of what policing is all about. It's really the heart of Jesus is to serve with all the power given to them in the world, that we wouldn't abuse it, but that we would use it to serve people. So I just want to pray for our officers that are in our family, but then also our communities and the people that we are doing life with, that we could come together in a way that exhibits unity and exhibits the gospel.